We will now have a conversation with our speakers to delve further into their thought process. To join them in this dialogue, I would like to invite architect Saurabh Malpani. He is a principal and co-founder at Artha Studio. Artha Studio is founded on the conviction of the evolving social patterns and use of sustainable solutions by merging the contingencies of craft and culture. Saurabh is an architect at Artha. During his initial phase of architectural practice, he has apprenticed with two known masters, Jeffrey Bawa in Sri Lanka and Alvaro Siza in Portugal. He studied at School of Architecture at CEPT Ahmedabad, Technical University of Delft on exchange scholarship and received further training at Faculty of Architecture at University of Porto, Portugal. I also request architect Madhusudan to please join us on the stage for the dialogue.
I realized when he comes to my table, he's comfortable there because I would remain in the background. So I'm not providing any kind of, and then just open. Then it's fascinating. Oh, now the voice is on. Okay. So that's what I said earlier, that he's worked with two masters. So I was looking for clues. The day I told myself this, so I said, I'm going to address only that person. So anything I look at, I look from that point of view. So I'll try and ignore anything else that is happening. You know, so just dismiss that and focus only on what is left of that channel. You know. And then the way he was drawing on my table, he trusts you to a point that you will do the plan according to the area requirement. He doesn't question you too much about that. But the magic is when he puts the tracing on top and he starts shading the built forms. And he starts moving the paper and goes on shading the built forms. So that time I realized what he's doing is doing a walkthrough. So he's concentrating on the unbuilt, which is exactly what Khan was doing in the Dominican mother house or whatever you showed. If you study those sketches and you study Doshi's sketches, unfortunately none of Doshi's good sketches are published. I don't know why the bad ones are selected. Because I've seen some absolutely amazing sketches of Doshi. Like the last time I met him, I had taken some of his sketches and showed him. He said, how did you get these? I said, this was Xerox from your thing only. He said, I have not seen this for years. So then I told him the significance of those drawings. It was one of the projects we were working on. All the projects that I worked on where I was very close to him never got built. So it was quite, I don't know why that happened. Many years later, Doshi was telling he worked with me and all that. So I said, yes, sir, but none of my projects got built. He said, no, but we had fun, no? So like kind of, anyways, I can go on like that. But the point I'm trying to make it, there is a man in conflict. And one needs to see that part of it also and understand that part, that one is not normally always aligned. So one is working. So I've come to the conclusion the journey of life is to align yourself, which Khan did all the time. Like recently I had a talk with Krishna Ben, who was SID. She was a student when the IIM project was going on. So she was the only one with a car in the school. So Doshi used to tell her to go and pick up Khan from the airport. She said once Khan came, he had two different shoes on. So she pointed out, and he didn't even realize that he had worn two different shoes. You know? So he must be in a different kind of a state all the time. You know? I can go on talking about that part of it. But the point is, there's a lot of validity in both the things that one is talking about. Yeah, I'll keep rest for next year.
I think I would like to add something, Premjit. Anything you would like to add in the conversation?
I just spoke now, sir. You can ask someone if they want to ask.
Yeah, I think I will would like to Yashoda. Any questions?
I don't have a question, but you spoke very briefly about beauty as a therapy. And if you could expand more on that, because we are taking, sometimes when we speak of beauty, we are talking very superficially. And I think we need to talk more deeper about beauty as a therapy that you mentioned.
That was Korea who said that, beauty as therapy. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, we just recently were at the KVDF at Kurlavarki, and this was the theme of the Varki Forum, what is beauty? And I mean, the things that, I mean, just to reflect on what Madhu said and also what Ajit just mentioned, the conversation about architecture, unfortunately, in India, for a large part, is either based on personality, on people's sort of persona, the great, this thing about wearing different shoes, or, this kind of the outer envelope of the person, or it is based on this kind of myth of the magical process. And so for a young architect or a student or someone like me, it's frustrating to get into this space thinking that beautiful things that are of lasting value, are impossible to get, that you have to somehow be 80 years old and then the light will shine on your head, or that you should have been born like Picasso and at 12 years old know what beauty is. And that's a difficult way to practice as an architect. The thing that's really important about what Madhu's saying, and I think maybe it comes out in a rough way. Every time I'm with Madhu, I'm intimidated and I'm scared. I'm intimidated because the work is, of course, sublime, and I have a better way to explain it than he does. And scared because every time he takes my name, I'm worried. What is he going to say? Um, but the thing about what's important about him, and all of us aspire to that, and that's a great lesson for a young student. And this is Wittgenstein who said it, that working in architecture is working on oneself. Now, each of us have our predicaments, we have our families, our pressures, the circumstances, right, in which we are manifesting. We are in this world in a certain way. And then we have our aspirations. Each of us have ambitions. We think of beauty differently. We consider different things beautiful. But the whole exercise of our efforts as a creative individual is to find that resonance that like Doshi says in the movie in Karma, at the end, in the end of the day, I go home and I must say, Arey, today I did something beautiful. What a lovely drawing I made, or I had this amazing conversation, or I saw this amazing beautiful movie. That moment is what we live for. That's what I was talking about earlier. You live for that moment of light, and that doesn't come often, and it is difficult. But the whole exercise is that finding of yourself in this kind of. So it's difficult to generalize and say that everything is going to see it, because we see across the country now small practices. I mean, Pooja is here, Avinash is here, young practices who are doing things of rare value. Now, the problem is that maybe the patronage isn't there, the mechanics of how economics work doesn't, we don't have the wonderful patronage of the state like in Spain. And so to manifest this wonderful talent in society is difficult. But where is the channel where, a young practice like Pankaj's or Avinash's or Pooja's or, all of the young people who are really sort of chomping at the bit, give me that big opportunity, because we have this notion that people don't have skill, or, the schools don't depend on the schools. Each young person who is doing amazing things is not because, it's because Picasso woke up at 12 and suddenly realized that if he did Caravaggio 13 times, that he would have the magic. This idea of history is not as simple as Madhu is saying. That I'm not saying that you just look at history in a benign and passive way. As a creative person, you're looking at history critically. How are you looking at it? I'm not looking at Doshi and Korea and saying everything they did is amazing. But I'm bringing to bear the things that I think are of value from these people. I love the Gandhi Smarak, right? How does he make it? I understand it. I try to figure it out. Now, even there are problems that I'm analyzing. So this notion of a passive observer to history is not what I meant. And this is why this current moment, that we're all living in this political condition, in this economic moment, how do we react to this? So this being in the world, that's the lesson of the great architect, that in that moment, they manifested a certain way of engaging with the world that was of value. Korea talked about equity. It's important to register that question as a core principle of Korea's. He makes the courtyard even in the smallest house because he wants the person to have his piece of the sky. This notion of equity is so central to Korea that in every project he's doing the same thing. It's the same void that you talk about, you know. But it is rooted in this idea of politics and equity. So if you're in the world as an architect, skill is a very debased sort of word to use. Skill to make a great section, to keep the water out. I'm hoping that that's not what you mean that the architect brings to bear. It's actually meaning and metaphor of people stopping to talk about technique, which is what you're saying. I don't want to talk about the brick of my building or the bonding that I did or the concrete shuttering that I made or the wonderful e-glass that I used to keep out the sun. But in the long term, what does the building mean? And that doesn't depend on me. It depends partly on me, but it depends on society. It depends on so many things that I have no control over. The BIC that I did, we take no credit for it. It's a building that we almost gave up. But the reason why it is of value in the city is because there is stewardship after the handing of architecture. So this ego that I, the architect, will be talked about in the soirees, you know, in the beautiful parties in Europe, it's not of value. If you made something of value that then was taken by the community and appropriated, like that amazing temple we went to, everybody's out on a Saturday, you're going into that temple, you go to that back, and it still resonates in a way that you can't explain. So how does that happen? And so if you were to think of yourself a little less importantly, that you were just a piece of a larger puzzle, and you were sensitive to that you were in that exercise identifying what your values are, where you come from, and what you're learning from the circumstances you're presented with, that then becomes really valuable. Now, unfortunately, there is this lack of patronage, and so maybe that has to change too. But I mean, there are so many things you can poke holes on these great, you know, I would say great people, but you may not. But the point of the whole exercise of either making a movie or looking at someone's work is to take from it what you think is of value. And that, I mean, that's my search, right? It's Wittgenstein saying that I, as an architect, am going to spend my life figuring out what my expression in the world is. And that expression as an architect is the result of the seniors, the friends that I have, the people that I meet, the books that I read, the music that I listen to. It's a sum total of all of that and the recognition of that expression coming as a result of that. So to make a general statement that we're in a shithole is a cheap shot, you know. Yes, of course, we're in a bad place. But it isn't that none of us are trying, you know. We are all putting in that some of us may be trying and not succeeding, and that lack of success is not a reflection of the lack of integrity with which we work.
This is exactly what I want you to speak. The provocation was mainly meant for this.
So, on this road journey, it will be very unfair for me not to mention that everybody talks. I just started walking, and pata nahi chala kab karwa ban gaya, you know. So many people joined. Last 2 months was absolutely, we were in heaven with him, and I tell you, the kind of emotion, all of us, so many names, you know, Divya, Prasanna, Pankaj, Porval, the smallest one, you know, Sneha, Riya, and not that too, but people from outside like Avinash and Pooja and all of them, they become part of whatever you call road or Navkar. You know. And I think that is where Doshi comes in picture. That is what Doshi is about.
Yeah, I think will I would road team Divya made the one small clip which is already on Insta where it talks about silence Doshi's words, and it's converted into very beautiful animation.
Saurabh, I just had a question.
Yeah.
Just one last question. Bijoy here again, the same culprit disturbing you again. So it's after a long comment, sorry. So uh, this room, I think today is filled with extremely different level of energy, which I must have not felt from the day I got familiar to the term architecture and then getting into the architecture school till date, I think. And the week, in some sense, is very extraordinary. Bijoy, we already met on Monday, I think, and you were part of the panel. And one of the things I would like to refer from the film Kannade, which makes this room very interesting in some sense, is a bunch of people who are curious with a bunch of people who are passionate discussing together makes any place a classroom of architecture in some sense, I think. And the way both of you were almost like artists or musicians, loving the same art but taking your own positions in an extremely neutral manner, respecting each other's position but still contradicting, is the most beautiful thing, which I think, or the most important thing, which is extremely and very urgently required in the Indian architectural scenario in some sense. And I think this could be an amazing start to something like this, where there's no glamour but people are very transparently talking about architecture. Now coming to the question, I think this is in continuation to what me and Madhusudan were discussing in the afternoon about um, a lot of us youngsters and students are, in most of our discussions, we are rarely talking about the core architecture, and most of it is becoming very kind of peripheral about a lot of issues, challenges, and the way Madhusudan was talking about the idea of either sustainability or materiality or things like that. And it's very less about architecture or the core which is discussed. So I don't know whether in some sense we've not touched that or we are incapable. So if both of you could respond about how can we just bring this focus back to the core values and core architecture.
It's your turn now.
You started all of it.
Yeah, I know. No, I was preparing for this for quite some time.
Uh, there's a really lovely book that Kenneth Frampton made with his Columbia students, and it's called The Genealogy of Modern Architecture. It's a very slim, small book. What's really beautiful about it, and this is, I mean, what Madhu was talking about, and what we don't do enough of in India. What Frampton did in the class that he took with these students is that he took different building types. Now, it's the start of the conversation. Let's take houses, for instance, and he takes two houses designed by two architects relatively at the same time, but in very diverse, and of the same size, but in very diverse locations. So different cities in different parts of the world. And he analyzes them through drawings that he makes the students do. So they're making hand drawings of the plans, the section. I mean, all of the sort of very simple, quotidian exercises that you would have as a student. But what's amazing about the book is there's a great, I mean, one of the great comparisons they make is between Aalto's Nordilund's Museum and Kahn's Kimball. Both were built more or less at the same time, 60s, 65. And they were both commissioned, one was commissioned by the state, the one that Aalto did, and the other one commissioned by a private collector. Now, what is amazing about the study is that at the end of doing all of these exercises of understanding how the water is managed, how the section is done, what the plan is doing, that they come to the metaphor of these buildings. So you're reading the plan and you're looking at Aalto's plan, built at the same time under a sort of government patronage, and it's a centralized plan with a large hall in the middle of it and a very prescribed route to get to the art. So The road to salvation, like the Catholics will say, is direct. Follow the signs and you will be saved. Whereas when you look at Khan's plan, which is a sort of democratic, not democratic, but it's a private institution, it's a private donor, there's no state funding, it's a completely open plan. Now, of course, one may say that this is reading into the plan, but what it forces the student to see is that through this exercise, so Kant's plan is like the Protestant plan. The ways are not clear, the signs will lead you elsewhere, but you choose your path to salvation. And so Frampton, through this simple exercise of running buildings and understanding the culture in which and the patronage by which buildings are made, that embedded in those plans, and all of us working in architecture, unbeknownst to us, are embedding into the plan the seeds of these circumstances we are presented with. Who's funding the building? How much money did you have? What's the site like? What are the cultural dispositions that we're dealing with and with the communities we work with? And so that kind of exercise, I mean, Madhu is right that you, as students in college, unfortunately, this kind of thorough reading, now forget that you don't come to the metaphorical understanding, that you don't get to that point. But through this exercise, you understand the mechanics of putting a building together. And through the looking and critically evaluating these buildings, that this exercise becomes really valuable. So rather than this exercise of making myth out of people, or, I mean, why don't we have these kinds of really looking, and again, institutionally, maybe this isn't happening. But I mean, people like you, there are a whole bunch of architects, young architects who are practicing, who are looking at what their contemporaries are doing. Moneo himself had this amazing class at Harvard, which then became that book, where he took 9 architects who were his contemporaries, 8 architects, and studied their trajectories to understand what was motivating them as practitioners. Why is he doing that? Not to teach the Harvard class, to have an insight into the creative process so that he can understand what he's doing himself. Now that's an inquiring mind who's putting in the effort to understand in very, very sort of practical terms, what are these buildings about? So this sort of in-depth, I mean, to really, and so when you, like I was about to say that people like you, or, there are a whole bunch of youngsters, and they're teaching us also to go out there, seek out the buildings you really enjoy being in, understand the mechanics of putting a building like that together, how are the pragmatic aspects of this building working? And in the understanding of the pragmatic, which is visible, which is tangible, you may, hopefully, understand where they lead to in terms of metaphor and meaning. I mean, what Ajit said about the circle in Khan's building, let's understand the brickwork first. Like, how was that circle made? Why is it that size? Why is it located there? What are the number of courses that are making that, Let's start there. What you can see, what is there visually, and then maybe we can come to that metaphorical and myth-related. That's the easy part. I think the myth and the metaphor are maybe the easy part, but I mean, this understanding we somehow just completely skip. And so I think that may be a good start if, to bring maybe more value in the way that we, I wish I did it more, but when we were in 4th year, Anil Dubey, our wonderful teacher, he made us draw by hand buildings. So he would ask us what buildings we liked, and then and it didn't have to be a spectacular building, whatever, my uncle's house or, my grandmother's village building, but he would make us draft it, make the plan, make the section, make the elevation. If there are details, put some details on the sheet, compose the sheet. That exercise, then it gets into your blood, You understand maybe the cadence of structure or the curve of the roof or the way the light is coming in through the window, the chhaja detail. It's very simple and maybe boring, but it goes a long way.
See, when I was critiquing whatever was happening was more from the institutional point of view and not the individual initiatives. Of course, there are exceptions everywhere. So, but are we interested in the exceptions only, or are we really worried about the critical mass? And for me, like, my point of view comes from we just lack that critical mass. Same goes with the skill too. There are exceptions always, yes. And my frustration comes from the fact that I can't find a single architect for 5 years who can make a small drawing and put a small building together. And I have every right to be critical about it. Because the institutions don't teach them to even draw, forget about putting together a building, as you were suggesting.
You need to start a college, Madhu.
Oh no, that's the worst. I'll run away.
Put your money where your mouth is.
I think we'll conclude with this. We're showing both. So we'll show the both small clips, 1 minute.
I've often asked myself as to what does it mean if I regard my gurus, Corbusier as an acrobat and Kahan as a yogi. I don't know whether to call these terms metaphors or analogies, but I like these terms because they describe them very well. An acrobat is continuously inventing at the risk of his life, and he does his act firstly, primarily, for himself. You see, he could have performed them in private, but he also likes to show them to people. So his problem is to do new things, take risks, then show them to people so that people also participate in them. On the other hand, a yogi is also inventing, discovering, but more by way of discovering the inner world, the substructure, the underlying order within, and he keeps it to himself. Kant was searching for an order which is visible, whereas Corbusier was searching for an invisible order. Often introducing means to disrupt the visible order, yet within an overall order. These are very interesting phenomena because order then begins to become a question by itself. Does an order imply that you must have a very definite, rigid system? Or can the order be achieved by a harmonious balance, a balance which is established without being rigid?
Life is a collage. Events overlap. Time loses its finality. Dreams take over. Finally, everything ends in a dance.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to all our speakers for such an intense and thought-provoking session. We are grateful for the contributions of our capable event partners, and an event like this is not possible without the efforts of our entire team. I would say thank you to all the team members of Road